Dear friends, during our last meeting, we went through chapter 11 of Revelation relating the two witnesses. And we checked everything Prophet Zechariah could tell us concerning these witnesses. Well, today we shall pick out teachings from another book. But prior to this, may I propose we read the text which we have not yet examined, that is, from verse 7 of this 11th chapter. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will be in the street of the great city which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. Now, after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. In verse 7, the two witnesses are at war against the beast coming from the abyss. We shall find it again in verse 17 and get a closer look at this beast then. Allow me not to talk about this beast now. This will bring us through two great events. So let's leave this aside. I would forget to continue in due time. The text contains some details which can practically be compared to what we see in the book of Esther. We must, in fact, go through the story of Esther in order to understand what will take place then. The story brings us back to the 3rd year of King Ahasuerus. King Ahasuerus, a Persian king, comes down in the lineage of Cyrus the Great. The latter happened to unite the Medes with the Persians. This kingdom, this empire, was known as the Medo-Persian Empire. The kings were Persians, but there were permanently Medes counselors within the Persian court, something not common in those days. As he is immensely rich, Ahasuerus decides to make a great feast, and he invites all the high ranked of his kingdom. It is said that he rules over 127 provinces. He calls the meeting in Shushan, the capital city, and organizes a feast which will last 180 days, that is, 6 months. The inviters comprise officials, dignitaries, nobles, in short, all those who have some kind of important position in the kingdom. He does not stop there. He will organize a 7-day feast for all his people throughout the kingdom. A rather curious detail is added to the story. Wine flows freely and abundantly. Everyone is allowed to drink as much wine as he wishes, but the text adds that no one will be compelled to drink. Even though he is not forced to drink, the king abuses of the beverage, and being tipsy, he will take a dramatic decision. So happy about himself, and so proud of the beauty of his wife, Queen Vashti, he asks her to do something quite unusual: show herself up unveiled before the dignitaries and the people. This being something unexpected and unusual, Queen Vashti is shocked and angry. She feels humiliated and refuses to obey. The king, once sober and getting all his wits back, decides, with his advisors, to take steps against Queen Vashti, who refused to obey her king, even though given an unusual order. Something must be done about this disobedience. So, the councillors advised the king to enact a decree according to which Queen Vashti will never ever come before the king. But Ahasuerus loves Vashti, and a month later he feels so bad about the decree he wrote. So, calling back his councillors, he inquires of them about the next step to be taken. The problem with the Medo-Persian law is that any decree that has been written cannot be changed. It must be kept as decreed. So he cannot come back on the decision about Queen Vashti. His good counselors advise him to organize a beauty contest throughout all the country, have all the most beautiful ladies selected, have them taken care of for months, and then, being well prepared, they will come before the king one by one, and the king will choose the one to be his queen. And this meets the king's approval. Among the most young, beautiful, chosen ladies of the kingdom stands Esther. Esther, of Jewish origins, does not reveal her identity. She will compete and will submit herself to all necessary preparations, but will not use too much make-ups, as she does not want to use too important subterfuges. Finally, it is her beauty that will make the difference. She is then crowned queen, thus replacing Vashti. Things are for the best, until the nomination of Haman as prime minister by the king. Haman, a careerist, ambitious, proud man, at first does not notice, while going through the gate to the king, that the many people standing there all ceremoniously bow down before him when he passes by. All, except one. As there are always troublemakers everywhere, some report that there is someone who does not kneel and bow down before him. That man is Mordecai. That Mordecai is no one else than the cousin of Esther. He is also the one who raised her up. He stands at the king's gate because each day he tries to get news about Esther or tries to send her news. Now, each time Haman would go through the gate, he notices that Mordecai does not bow before him. So he decides to act. He will not go directly against Mordecai. He seeks advices from his whereabouts, and knowing that Mordecai is a Jew, he decides to have the king sign a decree of death against all the Jews in the kingdom. But how to bring him to this decision? Will the king accept the idea of killing just like that a section of the population under his care? Now, Haman will find a strong argument. He will offer 10,000 talents of silver to the king. This reveals on one hand the wealth of Haman, and on the other hand, the greed of the king, who, by the way, is very rich. But it seems that he needs more. He then accepts the deal and gives way to Haman's pressure. So, he writes the decree and signs it. The decree stipulates that on the third day of the 12th month, possibility is given to all, not only to kill all the Jews, but to plunder their goods. Evidently, in all the palace the news is spread. It is catastrophe for the Jews. There is weeping and sorrow. Just as it was with the two witnesses quoted here wearing sackcloth and covering themselves with ashes. They will be living in deep sorrow. So, Mordecai must evidently bring the news to Esther. Not only will he inform her about the decree, but he adds, in your position, you must do something. But the problem is that Esther has not been invited in the king's presence for a month now. And she asks whether she can go and present herself before Ahasuerus. Mordecai's answer is quite clear. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time like this? Do not think that you alone will escape. For if all the Jews die, you too shall perish. So Esther musters all her courage and says, I'll present myself before the king. There was a strict law for the Medo-Persians stipulating that nobody can come in the king's presence without invitation. The penalty for disobeying this law is immediate death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter. Esther will try to enter the throne hall and see if the king will receive her. The latter is so happy to see her, he holds out unto her the golden scepter and proposes something extraordinary, saying, Queen Esther, what is your request? What do you expect from me? Esther, knowing how to prick the king's curiosity, answers saying, O king, come to the banquet that I have prepared for you, and do come with Haman. So does the king. He comes with Haman.
So does the king come with Haman. The latter's joy is at its peak. He realizes that he holds an exceptional position in the kingdom, as he is the only one invited with the king as guest in the queen's palace.
Haman is really happy, but this happiness is tarnished when, coming out of the palace at the gate, he comes across Mordecai, who will still not bow before him. Mordecai will not ill-treat him, but he will not move. He will not bow and scrape to him, and this is unbearable. So, he decides to talk about this to his close relatives, his wife, and friends. This is their advice. Why don't you erect a stake, and we'll see the outcome when just after the banquet you ask the king to hang Mordecai on the stake. So, the king and Haman set for the feast Esther has prepared for them. At this first meal, the king asked the same question. Queen Esther, what is your request? What will please you, even if it be half of my kingdom? I'll grant the request. Esther will again keep the king waiting. If it pleases the king, may he and Haman attend to the feast that I'll prepare tomorrow, and I'll reveal to the king my request.
Et là, je donnerai la réponse au roi. Que va-t-elle dire?
What will she ask? By then, Haman's joy has reached its peak,
Mais il a toujours ce
but
problème.
the Mordecai problem is still there.
Et cette nuit-là, le roi
That night, the king is troubled and cannot sleep.
et il n'arrive pas à trouver le sommeil. Alors il demande
He asks for the written chronicles and goes over each event that took place in the kingdom day after day.
Et dans les
There was reported how a certain Mordecai, knowing about two eunuchs who thwarted a plot to kill the king, warned the court about it, and the worst was avoided.
de tuer le roi. Et Mardochée en a eu vent, a éventé le complot, a donné l'alerte, et on a pu éviter cela. Et le roi dit, mais
Then the king asks how that man Mordecai was rewarded for his act, and is told that nothing has been done.
alors le roi
Comes dawn,
attend le petit
and with it comes Haman at the king's door,
Quand arrive
at the
le
palace
premier
gate.
jour, arrive aussi Haman à la porte du roi, à la porte du palais. Et le roi va
The
lui
king
demander,
asks,
Haman, que
Haman,
faut-il faire à un homme
what must be done to someone the king wants to honor?
Parce qu'il s'agit de lui.
Haman, thinking that it is he,
Ça pourrait
who
être
else
lui.
would the king elevate to the highest
Eh
position,
bien, voilà ce qu'il faut.
says,
Il faut prendre la
this is what the king must do.
le manteau
Someone must take the royal horse,
d'or sur la
cover him with the royal mantle,
et la promener
set on his head the royal throne.
Voilà comment
Then,
il faut faire.
driving him through the whole city, shouting, this is how it must be done to someone the king wishes to honor.
Est assez
It is hard
difficile à comprendre
to understand something like that,
dans l'esprit
had it not been on Haman's mind to take over the power.
que prendre la monture
Taking the king's horse,
manteau royal
wearing the royal mantle,
royal
crowned with the king's crown, what could be the easiest than to make a coup?
et donc
It is obvious that Haman had something on his mind. But alas for him,
mais voilà,
this does not concern
il ne
him.
s'agit pas de lui.
Well, says the king, do this unto Mordecai.
Pour Mardochée,
I think that at that moment,
là,
Haman is knocked down. He will be compelled to do unto the man he despises what he thought was good for him according to the king's order, setting Mordecai on the king's horse, cladding him in the king's mantle, crowning him with the king's crown, riding him throughout the whole city of Shushan, crying, this shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Back home, he realizes that his plan is all ruined. His friends concludes, if you have begun to fall before Mordecai, you will not prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him. Nevertheless, the next day, Haman attends Esther's banquet, and the king once again asks the queen about her request. What is it you want from me? What is your petition, Queen Esther? She replies, O king, let my life be given me. Your life?
qui est là,
Yes, this Haman here has signed with your consent a death decree against all the Jews. How can I see all my people destroyed? She then reveals that she is Jewish and will also be killed.
alors
The king is astounded.
terré. Il a
He has signed with his own hand the death condemnation of his own wife,
celle qu'il aime,
the one he loves.
et là il commence
His anger is raised against Haman.
contre Haman.
He walks out into the palace gardens.
Du palais, à ce moment-là, Haman
At the same time, Haman rushes towards the queen, seeking her forgiveness.
et au moment
As the king comes in,
où il voit
he sees Haman begging for forgiveness and thinks that he is trying to harm his queen.
violence. À ce moment-là,
At that very moment,
arrêté.
Haman's fate is
Haman
sealed.
va être pendu au
He will be hanged at the very gallows he erected for Mordecai.
et là inverse.
There, conversely, the king raises Mordecai to the position of prime minister in the stead of Haman.
Premier ministre à la place d'Haman.
Now, how to revoke the immutable decree? So, a new one must be written, sealed by the royal seal, stipulating that the Jews have the right to defend themselves. Everywhere the news is received with exhilaration and feastings among the Jews. The text goes on telling us more at the end of chapter 8, and we are going to read it together. Esther, chapter 8, verse 17. And in every province and city where the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joys and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many people of the land became Jews, because the fear of the Jews fell upon them.
Conversions to God's people is experienced. This event is an extraordinary example of what will happen at the end. While the people is threatened with death, a death decree being issued against them, this decree will finally not be applied. It will not only be ignored, but there will be last-minute conversions. And what came out in Esther's days, while people were rejoicing, sending presents and gifts to one another, there is inversion of situation. A similar experience occurred in Daniel's days. His friends went through a similar situation. There was a death decree issued against them. They were condemned to be thrown in a fiery furnace. But at the last moment, the very moment when they were in the furnace, God was there in the fire to rescue them. As it was in Esther's days, God's people was condemned to extermination, and the Lord, at the last moment, intervened and brought many to a real conversion. So shall it be at the end, the very end. God's people will be under a death condemnation decree. We read this in Revelation 13:15, where it says that all those who will not worship the beast and his image will be put to death. Finally, this decree will not be applied. God's people will be triumphant, not by human weapons, but by the word of God. And they will experience extreme joy in their hearts because of his magnificent deliverance. My wish is that we too experience this marvelous joy. I pray for this steadfastness for each one of us. It is when things seem most desperate that God intervenes, so long as we stay faithful to him, as it was for Mordecai, or Esther, or the three friends of Daniel, and as it will be for God's people at the end of times.